Okay, ladies and gentlemen, today's screencast is going to focus on the short answer question that we seem to have a lot of trouble with on the exam. So period 5, this was your short answer question. Periods 1 and 3, this was not your short answer question, but this is definitely going to come up on our essay that's going to be assigned this upcoming week. So we want to make sure that you understand the progressive era. We understand what actions were progressive under President Roosevelt, what actions were progressive under President Wilson. So I'm going to take you through the entire question. This may end up being 2 screencasts. We'll kind of see how long it takes me to kind of explain each president's progressive actions. So I'll let you guys know if it's going to end up being 2 screencasts. So essentially what the question asks is to kind of take the Roosevelt administration, give an example of progressive legislation, explain first what makes it progressive and then why it's significant, and the same thing for the Wilson administration. We're not really going to touch on C in the screencast. I just want to make sure that you understand progressivism, what makes something progressive, and how there was examples of progressivism in both the Roosevelt and Wilson administration. First big thing that we have to take a look at is what makes an action or piece of legislation progressive. So this, I think, is what you guys had the biggest trouble with on the exam, was identifying things that were actually progressive actions taken by the president. Many of you discussed, let's say, for example, with Wilson, you discussed the 14 points, which is a piece of foreign policy that America is engaged in. Many of you discussed, let's say, the Espionage and Sedition Acts under President Wilson, which is not a progressive action. That's something during World War I, a wartime action to suppress dissent. Under President Roosevelt, many of you guys were discussing his foreign policy as well, discussing imperialism, the Panama Canal, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Big Stick policy, all of which happen under their presidencies, but they're not progressive pieces of legislation. Many of them were not pieces of legislation at all. So that's the first thing to understand. The questions are a little bit more detailed than just give me something that happened under President Roosevelt's administration or President Wilson's administration. They're looking for progressive actions taken. Okay, so you guys have to understand what makes something progressive and what makes something not. Okay, so what does make something a progressive piece of legislation or a progressive action under a president? First thing is the progressive era. You have to remember the progressive era was designed, or the progressivism was designed to address the issues of industrialization. So you have to go back to the problems of industrialization, the working conditions of factory owners, factory workers, the city conditions living in tenements, trusts, monopolies, big business having too much influence, too much power. Those are some of the aspects of, or some of the problems that progressivism tries to address. When you look at progressive legislation must address a problem that was happening in American society due to the Industrial Revolution and due to that era. So it could be from big business gaining too much power. It could be corruption in the legislature. It could be unregulated business practices. It could be, something going on in a local level, although this question is about national stuff, but it could be about regulating food, regulating consumer products, but it's really about the government taking action to address the problems plaguing American society at the time. So hopefully you can see that those foreign policy things like the Panama Canal, the Roosevelt Corollary, the 14 points, they don't fit. They don't fit for what makes something progressive. What makes something progressive is it is addressing, trying to fix and reform American society, the problems that were caused due to the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of corporate power during the late 1800s. And then the second part of it is that they look for the government to step in and to try and address these problems. So, of course, with any of these, anything that's going on with Roosevelt or Wilson or any piece of government legislation that's passed by the national government, it has a second component of government being involved trying to fix the problem. Okay, so we're going to go through, so now that we have what makes something progressive, we're going to go through the different presidencies and kind of talk about their progressive actions. So first we're going to take a look at Roosevelt, and for Roosevelt's pieces of legislation, first you have to understand, these are not legislation that Roosevelt himself passes. Congress passes legislation that goes for any presidency. But they happen during the years that Roosevelt is the president. Okay? Now, we're going to look at what makes it progressive, and then why is it significant for each piece of legislation. So we're going to go through them relatively quick because this is a review. So when you look at President Roosevelt's time in office, there's two big acts that pretty much you should know very well that are passed under President Roosevelt, which is the Pure Food and Drug Act and then the Meat Inspection Act. Now, both of these are passed in 1906. The Pure Food and Drug Act is a way to regulate food and drugs that are going to be sold to the American consumer. And they're going to basically test for the quality of these products to make sure that they're safe for the consumer. So this is in response to unregulated business practices during the Industrial Revolution and into this progressive era. Unhealthy food being sold to the consumer, unsafe drugs being sold to the consumer. So this is an example of regulation, of regulation of an industry. And that's a progressive action because there's a problem in the society of unregulated industry exposed by the muckrakers, right, that we had talked about in class, like Upton Sinclair famously and Jacob Riis. And this kind of addresses it. Same thing is true with the Meat Inspection Act. The Meat Inspection Act is going to be regulation of industry, and it's there for consumer protection. So it's trying to solve a problem where they see meat being made in an unhealthy, unsafe, unsanitary way. Conditions are bad, and this is for consumers. They're saying conditions are bad for consumers. Consuming this, it potentially is a health hazard for the American consumer, and so they need to fix it and address it. And so that makes it a progressive piece of legislation. Now, what makes this significant? It's the beginning of regulating industries and making sure that industries keep products safe for people. So we have this today as well. You know, all different kinds of things are regulated by the federal government. An example, let's say, is, you know, seatbelts have to be in every car. That's a regulation put in by the federal government. It's a safety regulation to make sure that that product is safer for the person who's actually using the product. So Roosevelt is kind of on the cutting edge here of kind of inspecting, having government oversight of industries, which is a very progressive idea, to have the government regulate and have oversight over businesses and companies to protect you, to protect the consumer, and to protect people who are buying these products. Another big one that Roosevelt passes is called the Hepburn, or is passed under Roosevelt's presidency, is the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act is going to regulate railroad fares. So if you remember, the Populist Party really wants railroads to be regulated, and the farmers are concerned with this because they're being taken advantage of with the railroad freight shipping prices. So Roosevelt and Congress during the era is going to start to finally jump in and regulate the railroad rates a little bit and kind of not allow them to charge these exorbitant rates. So again, this is a piece of progressive legislation because it's addressing a problem of monopoly control over the railroads and taking advantage of, in this case, consumers, shippers, farmers, people who are going to use the railroads to ship their freight goods across the country. And a very significant act because it stabilizes railroad prices, it limits railroad tycoons' power, and it gives kind of more competition and more say to the American people. So it's again helping out the consumer. And if you notice Roosevelt's legislation here, most of his legislation is designed to, in his eyes, protect the American consumer, fight for the people, and kind of help the American people. So these are three good ones. You could have used the Pure Food and Drug Act, the excellent one, Meat Inspection Act. You could have used it as separate ones or together. Hepburn Act would have been an excellent one to use as well for progressive legislation. This one, the Sherman Antitrust Act, many of you guys actually, several of you did use this act. Now, technically this is not during Roosevelt's presidency. The Sherman Antitrust Act is passed in 1890. Now, for those of you who did use it, I did kind of accept it as long as you were able to link it to Roosevelt's use of the Sherman Antitrust Act. But just know it's not during his presidency. It was after his presidency that, you know, this act, he uses this act. So what's important about it and significant about it is it's designed to, not actually designed to break up trust. It's designed in the beginning to break up labor unions, believe it or not. And then later on, presidents are going to use it to break up trust and go after monopolies. And we know Roosevelt is famous for this, going, you know, the Northern Securities case and other cases going after trusts and monopolies that he deems hurting the American public. So it's a progressive thing to want to regulate these business practices, right? Go against the grain, not have laissez-faire government, and implement regulation and try and institute more competition into industry. So again, the Sherman Antitrust Act is not during Roosevelt's presidency, but if you used it and used it well, I just kind of noted that it's not during his presidency, but I didn't really take points off for it, maybe a very small amount of points off for it. All right. The other big thing you want to know about Roosevelt, this would have been tough to use a specific piece of legislation, but he's very big into conservationism. We didn't really talk about a piece of legislation, but again, if you had gone into this, but I don't think anybody talked about his conservationist issues, his things that he addresses. I would have taken it, even though it's not a specific piece of legislation, but you could have talked about his conservationist issues, his expansion of the park system out in the West. All of this would have been progressive legislation designed to preserve our natural landscape out in the West. Beginning of the environmentalist movement, which is kind of contrary to the problems of business overusing our lands. All right, Wilson's progressive legislation. We're going to go through some of Wilson's progressive legislation, see how much we can get through in the next 5 minutes. So again, another progressive president. You could have used any of the amendments that we talked about, all of the progressive amendments you could have used. Now, technically, the first progressive amendment, the 16th Amendment, is not under President Wilson. It's under President Taft, but it kind of carries over into his presidency. So I would have counted it if you had decided to use the 16th Amendment. Could have used the 17th Amendment, the 18th Amendment, or the 19th Amendment. Any of the amendments would have worked for Wilson. So I was, shocked at how few of you actually realized that these amendments happened under Wilson's presidency, or even thought to use them as, part of your legislation that are happening during the progressive era. So the 16th Amendment is graduated income tax. What you're looking at here are the different tax brackets. This is actually current from the new changes to the tax law in 2018. But what you should notice is that the higher your income, the higher percentage of taxes you pay. That is what makes this progressive. Another name for the 16th Amendment, they call it the graduated income tax, also called the progressive income tax, which means the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. Now, why is that progressive? It's addressing income disparity that was growing during the Industrial Revolution, that the rich were getting so rich and the poor were essentially not gaining any of the wealth during the time period. And so this kind of addresses that to a large extent. So that makes it progressive and very significant. It's the first income tax levied by the federal government. And people, I think interestingly enough, universally feel like they pay too much taxes in our current age. The top tax bracket back in this era was 7%. Now it's 37%. Or excuse me, about 37 to 38%. All right, the 17th Amendment is the direct election of senators. And so this, again, is a progressive piece of legislation. It takes democracy directly to the people. Remember, a problem during the Industrial Revolution was that people felt like they weren't having, or that the monopolists had too much of a say and power over government. So this, again, goes more directly to the people, which is an example of progressivism. And it's a major change, right? Senators used to be appointed by the state legislatures. Now, in this era, they get directly elected. Building off of that, you have the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. All of this stuff is happening under President Wilson. And so, again, this is expanding suffrage, which is a democratic thing. And that's definitely a progressive action to expand and give more people voting rights, addressing kind of this inequality and this lack of say within the government in earlier eras. The last one we're just going to take a look at is the 18th Amendment. So the 18th Amendment, also under President Wilson, is a progressive action because it's trying to address a social ill that they see in the society, which is too much alcoholism and too much, pervasive problems that go along with alcoholism. And so the 18th Amendment tries to address this, just like some of the reformers during the antebellum period. Okay, so there's some other ones during Wilson's administration we're not going to have time to discuss. The Federal Reserve Act, you could look that up, and then also the Clayton Antitrust Act. But hopefully this gives you a little bit better idea of what happened under which presidents, why they were progressive and why they were significant. Alright guys, I will see you in class. We'll have